The Australian Financial Review.
I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet. I pay my respect to their elders, past, present and emerging, and on behalf of the Australian Labor Party, I commit to the Uluru Statement from the Heart in full.
On election night, Anthony Albanese's first words as Prime Minister left no one in doubt about the government's top priority.
We can answer its patient, gracious call for a voice enshrined in our Constitution. Because all of us ought to be proud that amongst our great multicultural society, we count the oldest living continuous culture in the world.
8 months on from that speech, the rubber is hitting the road on an Indigenous voice to Parliament. The warring sides in the debate are sharpening the yes and no campaigns ahead of a referendum on constitutional recognition expected before the end of the year. Early polls suggested the voice had strong support, but there are high-profile dissenters and the government is under pressure to provide more detail. Welcome to The Fin. I'm Lisa Murray. Today, on the first episode for the year, we talk with Australian Financial Review political reporter Tom McIlroy about what's being proposed, why the stakes are so high in this referendum, and whether it will succeed. It's Thursday, January 26. Tom, later this year, Australians will be asked to vote on a simple question, which Anthony Albanese says will be something like, do you support an alteration to the Constitution that establishes an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice? So start by explaining what has been proposed. What is an Indigenous voice to Parliament and how might it work?
The federal government's picked up the notion of a voice to Parliament from the 2017 Uluru Statement from the Heart.
In May 2017, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander delegates came together at the First Nations National Constitutional Convention near Uluru and adopted the Uluru Statement from the Heart.
The statement calls for three things: a voice to Parliament, a truth-telling process and a treaty with Indigenous people. Labor has chosen that order, starting this year with a referendum on the voice question. Essentially, the voice to Parliament, it's a consultative body to the federal government and to the federal parliament for policy making on issues which affect Indigenous Australians, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders.
We seek constitutional reforms to empower our people and take a rightful place in our own country. When we have power over our destiny, our children will flourish. They will walk in two worlds and their culture will be a gift to their country. We call for the establishment of a First Nations voice enshrined in the Constitution.
It would prepare advice to guide policy making on issues which affect Indigenous Australians, and it would represent Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people at the grassroots through a local and national structure reaching up to the federal parliament and to the federal government. A truth-telling process could be similar to those that have taken place in other countries around the world, where there is a reckoning about the treatment, the mistreatment and the abuse of Indigenous people by settler classes. Australia hasn't gone down that road yet. A treaty process would be a formal document signed by non-Indigenous people with the leaders of Indigenous communities. Similar processes on treaty have taken place in countries including New Zealand and Canada, and currently states including Victoria are progressing treaties at a local level.
Over the past few weeks, debate has really intensified over the voice. Opposition leader Peter Dutton is targeting the government over what he claims is a lack of information out in the public domain about how it might work.
I think millions of Australians want to hear the detail of what it is the Prime Minister's
at the moment, because he won't provide the detail, and he's not willing to provide any of the detail.
So he won't provide the detail, and I think millions of Australians expect the detail.
The government has said that all of this detail will be negotiated and legislated after the referendum, but there are substantial reports out there that run to the hundreds of pages and include recommendations and proposals on design. So can you talk us through those plans and proposals?
There are a number of different models being proposed for an Indigenous voice to Parliament. The most commonly cited is contained in what's called the Karma-Langton report. It is a report that was presented to the former Morrison government before last year's federal election, led by Indigenous leaders Tom Karma and Marcia Langton. Although the government hasn't adopted that report formally, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese and senior ministers point to the design elements that are contained in it. For example, it would have a national voice speaking directly to Parliament, taking information from local and regional voices around the country. It would be a 24-member panel with gender parity, 2 members from each state and territory and the Torres Strait, as well as 5 members from remote communities around the country and representing Torres Strait Islanders living on the mainland. The proposed body in that report would serve 4-year terms, with half of the members elected every 2 years and a limit of 2 terms for panel members. The panel would advise the government on matters of national significance to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people relating to their social, spiritual and economic well-being. It would engage early in the policy-making process on a large range of issues. For example, if a health bill or a housing bill was about to be debated in federal parliament, the voice would be asked to give advice from Indigenous people. Local and regional groups would be part of that process, and at the very top would be 2 co-chairs, 1 man and 1 woman.
Yeah, no worries. So my name's Selwyn Button. I'm a Goongarri man from Western Queensland, and I am a member of the referendum engagement.
I spoke to Selwyn Button, the chair of the Lowitja Institute and a Indigenous partner at PwC Australia. He's a member of the engagement group established by the federal government. He said debate about details of the voice could be misplaced at this point in the process, and Button's view is that they are matters for federal parliament if the referendum is carried later this year.
I think the conversation about having the detail is a bit like the old adage of putting the cart before the horse, because as the opposition would understand that the detail comes post the referendum, because the detail doesn't go in the Constitution, because the Constitution is a principle-based document. All we're expecting the public to vote on in referendum day at the end of the year is the simple clause to be inserted in the Australian Constitution which describes the voice to Parliament. The next piece, as the opposition would know, the next piece of the puzzle is then the legislation that comes post to enact what that voice looks like. So the detail will be debated, the detail will be discussed, and the detail will actually go out for public consultation once we've had our chance to put it to the Australian public on referendum day in order to get the yes vote first, and then we go with the detail after that.
What is your sense of the Coalition's contribution and Dutton in particular pushing for detail? Is he playing politics with the push for the detail?
I think it's trying to distract from the real issue. And the critical issue here is how do we make sure that it is very much about keeping the Australian Constitution as a principle-based document and ensuring that the Australian public understand the process. And that's something that I guess is a bit disappointing in this conversation at this point in time, is distracting the Australian public by not describing what is the true process in relation to the changes to the Constitution. But what we've got to focus on at this point is the fact that we're trying to change a principle-based document so that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are sitting at the table with government and bureaucrats to ensure that the policy and legislation that affects them is about benefiting them and improving the lives and circumstances of every community.
Tom, when you look at the history of representative bodies in Australia, from Gough Whitlam's National Aboriginal Consultative Committee in the 70s to Malcolm Fraser's National Aboriginal Conference and then Bob Hawke's ATSIC, all of these bodies were set up and then abolished when there was a change of government. So how would this proposal for a voice to Parliament be different?
Those previous Indigenous representative bodies were set up and abolished based on the politics and the government of the day. A new government often meant that they had problems with lasting impact. The bodies were wound up or abolished. ATSIC, the most recent one, was shut down amid allegations of mismanagement and corruption. Anthony Albanese and people like Linda Burney, the Indigenous Australians Minister, make the case now that the voice to Parliament must be enshrined in the Constitution so that it can survive regardless of who is in government, regardless of what conditions exist in the political sphere, and that it will be given status worthy of the contribution of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people over more than 65,000 years here in Australia.
There's no doubt this is a priority for the government. On election night, it was the first commitment Anthony Albanese made as Prime Minister before he said anything else. What impact did that speech have?
The decision by Anthony Albanese and the Labor Party to give this such prominence, and the Prime Minister mentions it almost every day in public, was welcomed by the proponents of the Uluru Statement. Anthony Albanese is expending significant political capital to put this referendum, which is an unusual thing in Australia. We don't have them very often. They're difficult to pass. It shows that he's picking up from previous Labor governments on the issue of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander reconciliation in Australia, and that he's prepared to go out on a limb to create a lasting and meaningful reform for reconciliation. On the question of support, last year published polls showed about 60% support around Australia for the voice to Parliament. Just before Christmas, the Australian Financial Review published one poll that put support closer to 50%, but when undecided voters in that poll were pushed for an outcome, support rose to about 60%. Over the past few weeks, though, there's been a sense that support could be slipping away a little bit and that the political headwinds the government is facing are starting to take a toll. It's possible that we're starting to see the argument from the government and advocates of the voice being lost as the opposition pushes for detail on the plan and high-profile critics line up. A poll this week in the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age suggested support had dropped to about 47%, down 6 points from 53% 4 months ago.
Yeah, that is a drop, but when pushed to vote yes or no, 60% of respondents in that survey were in the yes camp. So tell us where the support at this stage of the debate is coming from, and do you think it's enough to get the referendum over the line?
History tells us that it's very difficult to get a referendum up in this country. Of the 44 questions that have been put to voters since Federation in 1901, only 8 have been carried successfully. Having said that, the largest vote in favour of a referendum question since Federation was on the landmark 1967 vote on Indigenous rights. That's considered a major milestone in Indigenous reconciliation in Australia. In terms of supporters for the voice referendum question, business leaders have been out in front of the politicians for a long time now, even going back to the Uluru Statement itself. We've seen significant movement from corporate Australia to advocate for the voice, even talking to their staff and customers about what it will look like, why it's important and why they should support it themselves. The Yes campaign peak body, and this is a newly formed organisation known as Australians for Indigenous Constitutional Recognition, they're in the process of appointing their first board, and the Financial Review revealed some of the big names connected with that. They're people like Wesfarmers Chairman Michael Chaney, Gilbert and Tobin Managing Partner Danny Gilbert, Lachlan Harris, who was a press secretary for Kevin Rudd and is quite well known, and importantly, the coalition-linked pollster Mark Textor, who's very widely respected. But as this week's poll showed, the political ground on the question of the voice is starting to shift. We've seen outspoken members of federal parliament, including the Greens' Lydia Thorpe and Country Liberal Party Senator Jacinta Price from the Northern Territory, speaking very critically of the voice, and they get great media attention. The proposition from them is that the sequencing is wrong, that the voice will either add a new layer of bureaucracy that won't help Indigenous people on the ground, or that treaty and truth-telling should come first. Anthony Albanese, I think, is under real pressure this week.
I think people want to know how it will work in Alice Springs at the moment. There's a national tragedy that's unfolding, and how will the voice help improve the lives of those young kids in Alice Springs?
the politics of the Voice has played into the situation of crime in Alice Springs and other remote Indigenous communities.
The Prime Minister has jetted into Alice Springs after days of mounting pressure over a crime crisis in the Northern Territory town. Tonight, Anthony Albanese remains...
Well, this is my third visit to the Northern Territory as Prime Minister. I intended to come to Alice Springs in December.
The crime wave that is happening in Alice Springs is helping bolster the argument that more practical, immediate action should be prioritised over constitutional recognition and the Voice to Parliament plan. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese and a delegation including Linda Burney flew to Alice Springs on Tuesday, and that came after real pressure from sections of the media and from Peter Dutton, the opposition leader.
The gap that exists in health outcomes, housing outcomes, life expectancy, incarceration rates between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. If everything was working all okay, then we should just keep doing it the same way. What a Voice to Parliament will do is to have a representative body that is able to advocate and give advice.
It's a long road to voting day at this point. We expect Australians will go to the polls in October or sometime close to the end of the year. The federal government has to work out if it's going to rework its political strategy, how much detail to put up, and critically, how it's going to sustain the argument for the Voice to Parliament for so many months.
And unfortunately, we've got to a position where we don't believe that this will genuinely close the gap. So the National Party has made a position that we will not support the Voice to Parliament. We believe in empowering local Indigenous communities, giving them the power at a local level, not creating another layer of bureaucracy here in Canberra, but to give those communities the opportunities.
Tom, the politics of this is really just starting to play out. The National Party has said it will oppose the Voice, but the Liberal Party and the Greens at a federal level are yet to lay out their position. So let's start with the Nationals. Was it a surprise move for them to come out in opposition to the Voice so early in the debate?
Yeah, the Nationals surprised everyone here in Parliament with such an early position. They said that they couldn't support a Voice to Parliament on the grounds that the federal government hadn't explained how it would work or what powers it would have, or how local communities in rural and regional Australia would be represented.
I've spoken to people throughout communities in the Northern Territory, those whose first language is not English, who don't understand a thing about what this Voice proposal is about.
That decision was led in part by Senator Jacinta Price,
who are living their day to day, worrying about how they're not going to encounter violence in their lives, worrying about how they're going to manage their affairs without humbug from their relatives who are dealing with alcohol and substance abuse, worrying about ensuring that their
She is a newly elected member of the Nationals Party Room and a Indigenous woman herself, and her advocacy against the Voice was seen as pivotal to that decision.
There are Indigenous Australians who do not agree with this, who do not know what this means. Minister Burney might be able to take a private jet out into a remote community dripping with Gucci and tell people in the dirt what's good for them, but they are in the dark.
It wasn't universally accepted in the National Party. The former Minister Andrew Gee, just before Christmas, announced that he was quitting the party and moving to the crossbench because he disagreed with the Nationals' position opposing the Voice to Parliament. The Nationals' early decision to oppose the Voice put significant pressure on Peter Dutton. The coalition is made up of the Liberal Party and the Nationals in a joint party room, and while the Liberal Party is yet to finalise its position, and Peter Dutton says that's something that will happen after debate within the party room, it's significantly more difficult for the Liberals to support the Voice now that there's on-the-record firm opposition from the Nationals.
It does put Dutton in a difficult position, and he's yet to declare what the party's position is. He's close to Noel Pearson, who's a passionate advocate for the Voice, but he's also close to Jacinta Price. He's described her as a rock star in the past. Where do you think he might eventually land on this question?
It's a fascinating political calculation for Peter Dutton. I think the role of Jacinta Price can't be underestimated. The Coalition, including the Nationals, have long supported Indigenous recognition, including under Prime Ministers like Tony Abbott. And Peter Dutton has previously expressed support for constitutional recognition. But the question of how the Voice to Parliament will operate and whether it's another layer of bureaucratic activity for Indigenous Australians is a live one within the Coalition. And there are constitutional conservatives within the party room who believe that adding a race-led organisation into the Constitution is inappropriate and will take Australia backwards. Peter Dutton could take a firm position for or against the Voice and bind Coalition MPs to it as a result of the debate in the party room, or there could be a conscience vote within the party allowing individual MPs to campaign for or against based on their own conscience and their own representation of their electorates. John Howard, the former Prime Minister and very well-respected part of the Liberal Party, has argued that that would be a mistake for Peter Dutton. John Howard has argued that the party should decide on a position and bind its MPs for or against the Voice.
And Tom, it's not just the Liberal Party that is struggling with its position on the Voice. The Greens too appear divided. At a national level, they say they won't stand in the way. And last week, the South Australian Greens declared their unanimous support. But the party spokesperson for Indigenous Affairs, Lydia Thorpe, has so far refused to endorse it. How do you think this will play out for the Greens? It's a difficult issue for them. And what will a confused response mean from them for the government?
It is a very difficult situation for the Greens and for Adam Bandt, the Greens leader. Lydia Thorpe is an outspoken and high-profile member of the party. She believes that the Voice should come after truth-telling and treaty with Indigenous Australians. The party, which is the progressive left force in Australian politics, would usually be expected to support an issue like this in the Indigenous affairs space, and a delicate negotiation is going to have to take place. Lydia Thorpe says she won't campaign against the Voice, but she's personally opposed. How Adam Bandt and other Greens MPs manage this will be fascinating, and every high-profile and outspoken voice against this proposal has the potential to whittle down support for it, potentially putting the referendum question at risk.
So, Tom, there's differing views among prominent Indigenous Australians about whether the Voice should be the government's top priority. Is there any indication yet of the level of support among Indigenous communities for what has been proposed? And how critical is that support ahead of the referendum?
Support within the Indigenous community itself is a critical question ahead of the referendum vote. We're seeing some outspoken opposition to the Voice, as well as broad support from participants in the Uluru process and some Indigenous leaders around the country. I spoke with Selwyn Button about opposition to the Voice within the Indigenous community. He said it would be unrealistic to expect a universal position from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians.
Our podcast, The Fin, comes out on Thursdays. This week, Thursday, will coincide with Australia Day. There's reports about possible Indigenous protests against the Voice on Australia Day. What's your sense about the split within the Indigenous community? There are some outspoken opponents of the Voice in that group as well.
Yeah, and look, it's certainly no different to what happens in general public policy debate across the Australian populace, is that you're never going to get 100% of people from a particular group agree on one thing that affects them. It doesn't happen in Australian public, within the Australian public, it doesn't happen within Australian politics. But what I can say is that those people who are out there protesting and saying that it's the sequencing, and they're not necessarily going against what we're talking about. They're not going against the Voice itself. What they're arguing about, many of them, is arguing about the sequence of steps. And the reason why the sequencing is Voice, Treaty, Truth in the Uluru Statement of the Heart is that we actually need to have the structural reform in place first to then affect and influence the other things. So treaty is still on the agenda. The process that we're focusing on now for this year And what we're working towards at the end of the year is the voice.
Tom, if the vote isn't successful, what would that mean for Albanese, who has made this the government's number one priority?
It would be a political body blow to Anthony Albanese and Labor to have gone out on a limb and expended political capital on the voice only to see it rejected by voters. Every time the Prime Minister speaks, he starts by acknowledging Indigenous Australians and asking for support for the voice to Parliament, including urging people to read the Uluru Statement. Anthony Albanese hasn't ruled out creating a voice to Parliament through legislation instead of adding it into the Constitution, but it's unlikely that Labor would take this approach if the voice is rejected by voters. The flow-on effect will be greater as well. Labor proposes a referendum on the question of an Australian republic in its second term if it's re-elected. If the voice to Parliament is rejected by voters, the likelihood of that going ahead would be severely diminished.
And Tom, beyond just the politics, what's at stake for Indigenous Australians and for the country in this referendum?
Regardless of people's views on the voice to Parliament, most agree here in Canberra and more broadly that the current approach to Indigenous policy is not working. Not only are closing the gap targets and other key metrics going backwards, but the amount of money and political effort being spent on improving the lives of Indigenous Australians is not delivering results. What is at stake is a huge reset in how the federal government decides Indigenous policy, and supporters of the voice say that there will be a direct improvement in the lives of Indigenous Australians around the country as a result of this change. It's also important to say that Australia's treatment of Indigenous Australians has been criticised around the world for a very long time. It's an opportunity for another major moment on the road to reconciliation, akin to the 1967 referendum and to the 2008 apology to Indigenous Australians by Kevin Rudd. If the voice proposal is not adopted, those opportunities will go away.
And this referendum is the most important question concerning Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians since the First Fleet. It is. We've got to understand what is at stake here, and what is at stake is the chance for reconciliation. And if this referendum is kiboshed through game playing and a spoiling game by the opposition, we will lose the opportunity, I think, forever.
Respected Indigenous leader Noel Pearson has argued that a defeat in the referendum this year would be a huge missed opportunity for Australia's road to reconciliation.
You know,
that's a big call. Do you think forever we will lose the opportunity?
Oh, well, forever, yeah. This because basically the question that will be put is, do we recognise Indigenous people in the Constitution? And if we say no to that, then I can't see how the future will be anything other than protest.
But Lisa, perhaps I'll leave the last word to Selwyn Button.
It is our best chance in my lifetime that we will have to progress this cause. But in saying that, if we don't get the vote going our way come the end of the year, Aboriginal and Torres Strait people are resilient people. We've been around for more than 65,000 years. I am certain that we will come back and try again in the future, but we're going to make sure that we do everything we can to get a yes vote come the end of the year at referendum day.
In 1967, we were counted. In 2017, we seek to be heard. We leave base camp and start our trek across this vast country. We invite you to walk with us in the movement of the Australian people for a better future.
Here's the other big stories we're covering this week. Annual inflation jumped to a near 33-year high of 7.8% in the December quarter, fueled by price rises in travel and accommodation and bigger electricity bills. While the latest result was below the Reserve Bank's 8% forecast, economists expect there will be further interest rate increases. Federal Treasurer Jim Chalmers said inflation is unacceptably high in Australia, but he believes it has peaked. And Rupert and Lachlan Murdoch have pulled plans for a $40 billion merger of the family's media assets, after a rival emerged to buy News Corp's US digital real estate business, Move. The Murdochs announced last year a plan to recombine News Corp and Fox, but said in a statement on Wednesday the deal was not optimal for shareholders at this time. Thank you for listening to The Fin. I'm Lisa Murray, with Tom McIlroy reporting today. The Fin is produced by Alex Gow and Lap Fan. Fiona Buffini is the executive producer. Our theme is by Alex Gow. If you like the show and want to hear more, follow us wherever you get your podcasts and consider rating and reviewing us as it helps others to find us. For more stories about markets, business and power, subscribe to The Financial Review at afr.com/subscribe. See you next week.
The Australian Financial Review.